Canelo Alvarez versus David Benavidez is probably not going to happen. With news of Berlanga and Canelo finalizing a deal for September 14th, it seems like the fight with Benavidez is no longer on the table. I was one of the believers that thought at some point Canelo and Benavidez would have to face. I think we can all agree that it's one of, if not the biggest fight in the sport of boxing. I'm pretty torn with Canelo's career recently. He's had some decent fights, but not good ones. No one called for the Charlo fight. The Munguia fight was okay, but up until that point, Munguia hadn't really proven himself to be worthy of facing a fighter like Canelo. David Benavidez, on the other hand, has been the mandatory for at least a couple years now, and we still haven't seen the fight. There's many reasons why this fight hasn't happened yet, but I think it goes without saying Canelo has control of the situation more than most fighters do. As the face of boxing, he can kind of dictate who his opponents are and when he gets to fight them. So we can talk about the fact that Canelo's currently fighting on the PBC and Benavidez is a PBC fighter, but I think it goes a little bit beyond that as well. When it comes to the reasoning that Canelo's given so far, whether it's the 150 million or the, what does he offer besides 25 pounds, these things have never been a problem up until Benavidez. As a Canelo fan, I myself have questioned, why is he making these kinds of excuses for Benavidez but not for other fighters? I remember a couple years ago, his response to the fight was, well, he hasn't done anything, he hasn't faced anyone else. If that's the argument that we're trying to make here, Munguia hadn't really fought anyone either. And one could argue that Benavidez is a more accomplished fighter than Munguia. On the flip side with Benavidez, he's been the mandatory challenger, and I've always kind of questioned why that mandatory was never activated. We heard news of the winner of Plant and Benavidez becoming the mandatory, but nothing really seemed to come through that. While I don't fault Benavidez for jumping up to 175 and trying to carve out a legacy of his own, I think that he should have done everything in his power to try to get that actual mandate going. But of course, Canelo represents a much bigger paycheck and a much bigger cut for the WBC than David Benavidez would, so they're going to follow, whatever it is he advises. As a 4-division champion, it's clear that Canelo's at the twilight of his career. Benavidez is just hitting the peak and the prime of his power. His last 3 fights were against better opposition than he's ever faced. The Caleb Plant fight, while many people think that it was a dominant performance, you could argue that Caleb Plant won at least 5 of the first 6 rounds. The Demetrius Andrade fight was an interesting fight because up until that point, no one knew what Demetrius could do with an actual champion or a fighter that was considered elite. Demetrius showed that he might have been a little past it, and unfortunately he was one of those fighters that never really got to showcase what he truly could have done. So after the domination of Demetrius Andrade, we saw Benavidez go up to 175 and face Gvozdyk. In a not-so-stellar performance, the beginning rounds were pretty solid. David Benavidez was applying a lot of pressure, but after an apparent hand injury, the punches just weren't getting to Gvozdyk in the way that many of us thought they would. Another point that people like to bring up is that David Benavidez himself doesn't sell pay-per-views and he's not a big star. I think people tend to forget that Triple G wasn't a pay-per-view star either. And even though Triple G wasn't one of the biggest stars, he represented one of the highest gates for Canelo, including some of the highest pay-per-view buys. Much like that fight, I think Canelo versus Benavidez is greater than the sum of its parts. This is one of those fights where the general boxing public is aware. You have commentators and analysts like Stephen A. Smith constantly bringing it up. You have people inside the boxing community constantly asking, when's the fight going to happen? You also have analysts like Paulie and Teddy Atlas saying that Benavidez would just walk right through Canelo. I, for one, don't agree with that. Even with all this said, I think Canelo still would win the fight. I would favor Canelo due to experience, his sharp counterpunching, and the aura that he gives off when fighters fight him. I remember looking at Billy Joe Saunders and seeing the nerves that he had when entering the ring against Canelo. Not comparing Benavidez to Billy Joe Saunders, but it's a common thing with Canelo opponents where they talk a big game, but once the bright lights hit, they kind of, tuck their tail. A recent case of that is the fight against Charlo where Jamel kind of spent the whole fight running around the ring and avoiding Canelo's power punches. People tend to say that Canelo is past his prime, and I'd agree with that sentiment to some case, but Canelo's B game is a lot better than a lot of fighters' A game. A lot of people like to say that Canelo entered the 168 division only after Benavidez has lost his title. But I remember reading an article where Billy Joe Saunders and Canelo were negotiating to fight for his belt sometime in 2019. When that article came out, Benavidez was still a champion. He hadn't lost his belt on the scale yet, and if he would have kept it, he probably would have been one of the fighters that Canelo faced. Even though that was the case, I think what many wanted to see was Canelo and Benavidez actually fight for that WBC belt. A lot of people weren't happy with the fact that the Callum Smith and Canelo fight, had that belt attached to it as well. The year that Canelo fought Callum Smith, Avni Yildirim, Billy Joe Saunders, and Caleb Plant was a historic year. I think people underrate that run. I remember around that time people were saying Canelo was on a Euro tour, which I think is funny because we give Andre Ward a lot of praise for the fighters that he faced, and his best wins consisted of mostly European fighters. I think the time to make it would be now. The longer we wait for this fight, honestly, the worse it gets for Canelo. You see, Canelo's been through a lot of wars. The chances of him winning are dwindling every day, and Benavidez is only getting stronger. The real key difference here is the experience and the IQ. Benavidez makes a lot of minor mistakes, and with a fighter like Canelo, you'd think that he'd be able to capitalize on those. The other aspect of this fight that I don't think I've seen anyone really mention is the fact that maybe Benavidez is trying to avoid this going to a purse bid. The reason I say that is because if the mandatory was called and a purse bid was initiated, I think the split for the champion to challenger is like 75-25. The Benavidez team would know that there's a huge chunk of the gate and pay-per-view buys that wouldn't go to them should they just try to negotiate the fight separately. The other comment that I've seen floating around is when Eddie Reynoso said that at this point of his career, they're watching who Canelo fights and when he fights them. The main factor that people like to give Benavidez over Canelo is the stamina and the number of punches thrown. I think in this last fight with Munguia, Canelo used him as sort of a litmus test in the sense that let me see what I can do with a young, hungry fighter, one that has a lot to prove, throws a lot of punches, and can apply pressure. As stated earlier, I still favor Canelo, and honestly, I see him winning the fight either 7 rounds to 5, 8 rounds to 4, potentially a late stoppage, but the more he waits, the worse it gets for him. If this fight doesn't happen within the next year or two, it's never going to happen. The truth of the matter is, it'd be a shame if we didn't get this fight, and at the moment, it's not looking like we will. With that being said, I'd like to know your thoughts. Do you think the fight will happen anytime soon? Who do you have winning the fight? Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I appreciate you all tuning in. Stay tuned for the Fighting Post. Peace.